Well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you, Mark, for everything that you and all the people at the People's Pledge have done to make this day happen. It is a real privilege for me, as a Labour MP from Vauxhall, just down the road, to be speaking to you all today. It's a great pleasure to see so many people here. The title, I think, of my talk was Britain and the EU, but of course it is about the UK and the EU, and it's great to see people here from all over the United Kingdom. And the one area that wasn't mentioned, of course, by Mark is Northern Ireland, and we're very lucky indeed to have a majority of members of Parliament from Northern Ireland who are supporting a referendum. And it's so important that we see here today everyone united against, first of all, united to demand something that is so basic and so simple: the right to be consulted about democracy in our own country. And we're united too against that cosy establishment which wants to ignore our voices and silence our process. And that's what the People's Pledge is all about. Now, the speakers throughout today represent views across the political spectrum. And that is so right, because, let us remember, democracy isn't the prerogative of one political party. It is for members of all parties and for those who are not in parties. And together, we are much more powerful than political parties alone. And governments need to remember that. Now, few things anger me more than the persistent attempts of some elements of the media, I think notably the BBC, to portray Euroscepticism or even mild criticism of the EU as all about Tory splits, Tory rebels, attacks on Cameron, and so on, implying that it is only an issue for the right. And when I say media, I do exclude some of those newspapers that probably, as a Labour MP, I would not be expected to read. But I do have to congratulate the Daily Express, and indeed the Daily Mail, and indeed the Sun. Because they have not taken the sneering attitude that many of the media has, the kind of coverage that implies that somehow we are fringe people, fringe views, and any sensible mainstream person should treat Eurosceptics, Euro-realists as cranks. Well, I've got a message for the media, and I've got a message for the politicians. If they're calling me a crank, and if they're calling everybody here a crank, then they're actually calling the majority of the British public cranks. Because we know that the majority of British people are disillusioned with the EU, opposed to the whole direction of the European project, and want a referendum. And then this morning I hear that my leader, Ed Miliband, has said, not quite directly that we're cranks or that we're barking, but that anyone who wants a referendum is a barking. I'd like to remind Ed Miliband that 52% of Labour voters want a referendum. The latest poll shows even more. And that actually it is rather silly, I would say, putting it mildly, of a Labour Party leader to be criticising so many of millions of Labour supporters in this country who want a referendum as barking. As a Labour MP, it is very frustrating to see Labour views sidelined in this way because, as I've said, thousands of Labour Party members and millions of Labour Party supporters want our party to stand up to the EU. And after all, it was once Labour Party policy to withdraw from the EU, and it was the Labour government in 1975 that gave the public the only opportunity we've ever had to vote on European membership. We now have to come together, ordinary people from every political party, even the Lib Dems, to argue for democracy against an establishment that colludes and connives to refuse us our basic civil right to have a say in who is making the laws in our country. And ironically, this struggle for democracy has always been the basis of the Labour movement and the Labour Party throughout the centuries, from the levellers and trade union pioneers to suffragists and campaigners against discrimination in all forms. The left in this country has always been at its best when we have fought to enfranchise and free people from systems that denied them a voice. How can we call for civil liberties when the EU forces on us unaccountable extraditions through the European arrest warrant? How can we ensure the jobs and growth that we need when vital contracts for work go to preferred bidders on the continent and not to British firms? How can we preserve and improve our public services when directive after directives are forcing, for example, the privatisation of the Royal Mail and will now maybe bring the NHS under EU competition law? I say to the leadership of my party, to Ed Miliband, this is our opportunity in the Labour movement to reassert our traditional values. You rightly said at conference that you were going to get the Labour Party to campaign against the misuse of concentrations of power in the banks, in the media and in politics. Well, Ed, where is the greatest concentration of unaccountable power? The EU. As we will undoubtedly hear throughout today, an increasing percentage of our laws are not made in our town halls or in Parliament, but in Brussels, where only 9% of the MEPs are British and they're elected through an electoral system that guarantees them almost seats and leaves them unaccountable for their actions. And it's no wonder they don't really listen to us. And this democratic deficit casts a shadow over politics, completely all politics in our country, and there's no wonder that the public is even more dissatisfied now, and the dissatisfaction continues to grow with politicians and party politics. We cannot let the establishment try to belittle us and tell us that the United Kingdom is a weak country, depending on the EU for its place in the world. We are a great country with the passion and energy to maintain our greatness, and we must not be frightened or conned into believing otherwise. Now, I may disagree with other speakers today about what policies I want to see the government pursue, but we can all agree that it should be our government that has those powers. What's the point in arguing about policies or ideologies when our sovereignty has more and more been given away to bureaucrats in Brussels? That is why this movement is so powerful, because we are united over something far more important than what divides us. The Labour leadership is joining with the Tory and the Lib Dem leadership to whip MPs on Monday. All three parties are ignoring the wishes of the public and colluding with this elite in Brussels that it has its head proudly and arrogant in the sand. And we've been told that the vote on Monday is a distraction from the real issues. It's strange that just a few months ago we were permitted to have a referendum on something very few people wanted, the system of voting. But we aren't allowed a referendum on the fundamental issue of who is running our country. The issue is not a distraction. The EU pervades every part of our lives. It's the common thread that goes right through every rule, every law. It's a juggernaut which is bloated, over-bureaucratic and undemocratic, and it must be stopped. So Monday's vote is not the culmination of our efforts, but it is the first crack in the brick wall that the establishment has erected to protect the EU. Like many of you here, I opposed and voted against the Maastricht Treaty. I opposed the campaign to join the euro. I campaigned to have a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty. Many of us on the Labour side were mocked and derided. It was quite a lonely place at times, but it's lovely to see so many of my colleagues here today, like Kelvin Hopkins sitting on the front. But the tide is turning. The tide is turning. The bricks are beginning to fall out of that wall of protection. And like on the euro, we know we are right. The public is on our side, and we're not going to give up. So my message today is to be proud of what has been achieved in the short time since the People's Pledge has been set up. Be proud of all those people from all the political parties and all the other organisations who collected the hundreds of thousands of signatures for the referendum. All of the pro-referendum groups must start to work together. We must keep united around the single demand for a referendum. This is not the time to have personality problems and people wishing to divide using personality as a division. The single demand for a referendum can unite us. We have to put our party political differences aside, and that includes UKIP. There is no time for personality cults. The future of this country we love and are proud to be citizens of is at stake. We must win, and the only way we can win is to build on the power of the British people. Let us go forward today to do that, because we can do it and we can win.